Dear God, we thank you for the lingering joy of Easter. May our thoughts be lifted as Jesus was. Amen. So all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all as any had need. This passage has made people nervous for a good long time, but a colleague of mine likes to say that this is not communism, it's commonism, about holding everything in common. Jesus had transformed some people, and so they acted out what they'd experienced. Simple as that. An earlier portrait of such a community exists in the New Testament, one that's in fact a bit more specific about the process involved. It comes out of the letter of 1 Peter. This community of early Christians had been through misery growing up in the first century Mediterranean world, and because of the church, the earliest church, they were rescued from homelessness and found their feet. And here's how the writer of 1 Peter puts it. You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, speaking to the homeless, that you may declare the praise of the one who called you out of darkness into God's marvelous light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received it. So the Christians living in Asia Minor to whom this person writes were foreigners, literally strangers living in strange land, who'd been welcomed in those urban settings by Christians. The Christian communities of that day were little assemblies of women without husbands, slaves without masters, foreigners living in someone else's country. They were viewed with suspicion and hostility by many of those around them, all except the Christians whose communities dotted the urban Mediterranean world. Fact is, the Christian church may have initially been established, in fact, because of migration, widowhood, and homelessness. These were what was needed for this faith of ours to begin. Migration, widowhood, homelessness. Everything, of course, in life has to do with timing and location, right? And the establishment of institutional religion is no different. I've explained this once before in a different sermon, but it's so foundational to understanding the beginnings of Christianity, and more importantly, its essential ethos, the one we got from Jesus. So forgive me for repeating this. But in the first and second century, more and more people in rural areas were surviving childhood. The young men who ended up in their teen years alive had to decide what to do with themselves. Because of the law of primogeniture, it was the firstborn sons who inherited everything from their fathers if there was anything to inherit. So what's a young man to do then if he survives to, say, age 13 and his older brother is first in line to get the family farm? He might move to the burgeoning cities where he knows there's need of day labor. And how does he get his start? Well, thousands of young men went to the cities and ended up, in fact, quickly on the streets with nowhere to go. And we know it was Christians, in many cases, who picked them up out of the gutters. Christians saw it as part of their mission to house these people, feed them, help them to find jobs that they needed to survive. And who funded the enterprise? Mostly it was widows who had some property. Here is why. Because men in the Roman world would put off marriage until their late 20s. They would marry women who were around 14 years old, in fact. And when the men would die in their late 30s of one thing or another, their widows in their 20s would often then have money and a home. And they knew that if they remarried, they would automatically have to give everything they owned to their new husbands. Now, why in the world would anyone do that? I mean, if they were smart. Well, many were indeed smart, and Christianity welcomed those women into their communities. So those women would join communities full of like-minded women who knew better than to marry and give up everything. Besides, the teachings of Jesus said that women were people with rights too, rights to everything men had rights to. And in the letters of Paul, we can see that women were with property, often became leaders of these early communities. And in this way, the early church in Asia Minor became a home for the homeless and the husbandless. Persecution of such communities was a chronic problem. Many thought these communities were nothing more than cults. They did things differently, and complaints were often made against them. But the authorities most often did their best to mitigate these troubles. That's also seems to be in the law records that we find. People came to see, in fact, that those who called themselves Christians were doing work necessary for the safety of everybody in those cities. Getting folks off the streets is always a good thing. Many came to see that the health and welfare of all depended on doing good to the poorest of the poor among them. Well, if there's one lesson that comes out of this pandemic, let it be that we have learned that the health of the wealthiest among us depends on the health of the poorest, right? It's obviously true, but getting the rich among us to admit that is no easy thing. The narcissism in our country is as widespread as the virus was. And that was not the spirit of the community Luke speaks of in Acts, nor Peter's community that we were reading about as well, nor should it be ours. Remember, Peter's community was a community of immigrants. It was made up of people who were hungry and lonely and jobless and homeless and a step away from death in many cases. But they were plucky too, which had gotten them to the cities. Had it not been for the Christians treating them like valued neighbors, they would not have survived. Those early communities were not always peaceful. You can be sure they had difficulties getting along together, but they were made up of people who knew how difficult survival could be in that world and that time, and so they gave people a break when they needed it, even if that made them feel a little like chumps once in a while. Listen to this story from Carol of Three Rivers, Michigan, that updates it a little bit. When my husband and I were a young married couple, we had a neighbor who was a single mom and needed a lot of support. She often came over to use our washer and dryer or just to drink coffee and visit. One day, I hosted a committee meeting for a community group. The members were all older and more affluent than I was, and I wanted them to think highly of me, so I served dessert and coffee on my best china. Everyone seemed comfortable until my neighbor walked in with her robe on, got herself a cup of coffee, and pulled up a chair. Once I introduced her, she took over the conversation and proceeded to tell everyone about her troubles. Troubles with her boyfriend, who was a boating enthusiast. She was thinking of breaking up with him, she said, quote, "He never seems to have any time for me. He's too busy with his boat and his wife," she said. Now, with that story fresh in mind, listen to this next one. It's by the journalist Sebastian Junger. It's about how he hitchhiked across this country when he was very young. And here is what he had to say about the day he was making his way through the aftermath of a blizzard in Gillette, Wyoming. After 2 or 3 hours, I saw a man working his way toward me along the on-ramp from town. He wore filthy canvas overalls and carried a black lunchbox. As he got closer, I could see that his hair was matted in a way that occurs only after months on the skids. I put my hand on the pepper spray in my pocket and I turned to face him. "You been out here long?" he asked. I nodded. Where are you headed? California, I said. Warm out there. Yeah. You got enough food? He asked me. I thought about this. Clearly, he didn't have any, and if I admitted that I did, he'd ask for some. That would mean opening my backpack and revealing all my expensive camping gear. I felt alone and ripe for pillage, and I just didn't want that. I got some cheese, I said. You won't make it to California with just a little cheese, he said. You'll starve. At first, I didn't understand him. What was he saying? I kept my hand on my pepper spray. Believe me, he said, I know. Listen, I'm living in a car back in town, and every day I walk out to the mine to see if they need me. Today they don't, so I won't be needing this lunch of mine. I began to grow smaller with understanding. In his world, whatever you have in your bag is all you've got, and he knew, quote, a little cheese would never get me to California. I'm really fine, I said. I don't need your lunch. He shook his head and opened the box. It was a typical church meal, a bologna sandwich, an apple, a bag of chips. I kept protesting, but he wouldn't hear it. I finally took his lunch and watched him walk back toward town. I learned a lot of things in college, Sebastian Junger says. I learned things traveling in Europe and in Mexico and in my hometown of Belmont, Massachusetts. But I had to stand out there on that frozen piece of interstate to learn generosity from a homeless man. Now, I imagine that the church Peter addresses is full of people like the one who lived in his car, and also the single mom in the first story I told you about. And I imagine the people in those churches struggled with that, with deciding how best to deal with all kinds of people, and they didn't have any pepper spray, right? People who have learned different strategies for surviving in a world where, the rich get all the breaks. We've all heard stories like one I remember from NPR, where a social worker, I remember, spoke of a woman who always had the latest cell phone with all the bells and whistles and often sported perfectly done nails, but who was forever saying she had no money for diapers. Stories like that fill Fox News, right, and social media, and they turn off the empathy in the best of us, right? We don't usually want to deal with those people. Or with people who frankly scare us because they look or smell different from us. I'm talking about the impulse we all have to keep our finger on the trigger of our pepper spray. But let me suggest the following. Maybe the real question at hand, every time we choose to look a stranger in the eye, is, will this encounter open me up to my own poverty? A poverty which may have nothing to do with money. Will an encounter with a family promise mom or someone at the Blanchet house open me up to my own loneliness? What I'm saying, of course, is that choosing to look a stranger in the eye may become a mirror to help us look at our own despair about living. Of course, this requires courage, no doubt. It may require that we remember some things about our own youth, our own childhood that may be very tender still. Wounds left untended for decades, maybe. But there is healing available if we are willing to try and find the tender, sad heart at our deepest place. I'm aware that I'm saying this in the wake of a number of tragic shootings of people who went to the wrong house or the wrong car and were killed because the armed person they faced was brainwashed by social media, Newsmax, Fox, whatever, into thinking that they probably are intruders. Unfounded fear is usually behind everyone's worst decisions. Unfounded fear is usually behind everyone's worst decision. One more story. This one could be written by any of us about a fellow church member named Anne who marches to her own drum beat. And Anne seems so intense, and I wondered if perhaps she was also a little cuckoo, writes the person who put this down, which I suppose is not politically correct. Anne sometimes sounded like a mad Old Testament prophet beseeching us to tend to the starving people of the world and save the rainforests. She was so unabashed in her faithfulness and need that it made some people nervous. She was like your craziest aunt, the religious one with funny eyes who drinks. Initially, I tried to keep my distance and make her understand that she and I were more church family than friends. But she did not seem to get it, or simply would not obey. She brought me Mary, Mother of God mementos and Jesus-y things to carry with me when I traveled, and she called me sometimes to ask how my son and I were. Little by little, I let her into my heart. True, she was odd, but she was also courageous and dear and kind and feisty and very tender toward children at church. I started sitting next to her during worship, sharing a hymnal or a Bible, and calling her at home from time to time to ask how she was. The woman who tells this story asked Anne to visit her Sunday school class of 5 to 12-year-olds that she taught and talk about her faith. Anne started by asking each of them their names and then whether they had noticed anything unusual about her. There was a polite silence among the children. They shook their heads with burlesque, puzzled looks until one child all but smote his forehead and said, "Oh, you mean your hand?" The child was referring to what Anne called her paw, P-A-W. She told them that her mother had been a chemist for the military in World War II, helping develop chemical weapons. Her mother and several of her colleagues had given birth to children with birth defects. Her defect was being born with a hand that wasn't completely formed. She showed them the scar tissue where she had had surgery as a baby, and the kids studied it with fearless attention, the kind they'd have for looking at a huge potato bug. She told them how family pictures were arranged so that other people's bodies hit her hand. "My mother found me disgusting," Anne said, "and only a few people over the years wanted to hold my hand. I felt totally alone, until one day Jesus came into the great emptiness." It happened when Anne was 6 years old. She felt Jesus speaking to her. He was saying, "I'm sorry it turned out this way," she said, "but you are whole in my eyes." "So I got me back," she said, "and in Jesus I found a real mother." "Did you mind having only one hand?" a girl asked. I didn't like it at all. It's been harrowing. And there are many things I love to do that I can't do well. Having this paw made me notice how much suffering there is in the world. And it makes me ask, what's that suffering about? What's the answer? The suffering itself means nothing, but the answer is also that I can't look away from it. I saw that God wanted me to help relieve the suffering of others, and that work has given me peace. Anne's life, the writer said, was ended by cancer not long after her visit with the children. Her husband asked that the children make decorations for her casket, which they did, and the parents delivered them to her home and decorated the casket themselves. At her funeral, the pastor said this, "Faith is not how we feel, it is about how we live." And Anne lived her own eulogy, gardening, praising God, fighting the great good fight for justice, loving her husband, playing piano, doing her yoga. Anne believed without wavering, you don't run into such faithfulness often, faith in the goodness of the world. I think that kind of faith, that kind of belief in the goodness of the world is what set the early church on a firm foundation. Not guilt, no, not the preaching of guilt, not the ecclesiastical power of early church leaders who only wanted to be bishops. No, it was the simple faith of the rank and file members who'd grown up knowing misery and the stern judgment of their betters, but who found some within the church who offered them love and mercy and full membership into the family of God simply because they were created by God like all the rest of us, right?